Hey everyone, welcome to the next video in our Cross Week series, going from Jesus' betrayal all the way to the cross, and then we're going to celebrate together on Sunday, Easter Sunday. So last week, as we were looking at Luke chapter 22, we finished with Jesus in the garden with this time of his great agony as he's praying to the Father, and his disciples are falling asleep. They're sleeping for sorrow, falling into temptation. And that's where we're going to pick up now, what happens after this. So we're going to begin in verse 47. And this is what Luke describes. While he, and that is Jesus, was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. What an incredible scene. This is the moment where Judas, who Satan has entered into, now betrays Jesus. His rabbi for 3 years, he betrays Jesus to the chief priests and to the temple guards. And to think that he would betray him with a kiss. You don't betray people with kisses. A kiss in this culture was a sign of respect and love. And yet here's Judas in the dark of night going up to Jesus to help show the chief priest who Jesus is in the darkness of the night. This is the one that you are looking for. And to hear Jesus' words, Judas, he says his name, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Notice that it doesn't say, would you betray me with a kiss? Now obviously the Son of Man is himself, but when he says the Son of Man, we understand the weight of what Judas is doing here. The Son of Man, this is language that comes from Daniel chapter 7 about this one like a Son of Man who the Ancient of Days gives a kingdom to, and this kingdom is going to be better than all other kingdoms. This is the Son of Man, and Judas is betraying him. You got to feel the weight of this, a huge, huge weight. The other part of the scene, which is interesting, is you have Jesus' disciples, retaliate with their swords. Right? In their minds, the Messiah is going to conquer Rome. He's going to set up his king, and he's going to set up his kingdom as king. So they ask Jesus, shall we strike? And they don't even wait for Jesus to respond. Simon Peter, we find out in a different gospel, jumps out and cuts off a man named Malchus, his right ear. And what's beautiful here is that Jesus practices what he preaches. Not only last week or yesterday when we looked at his prayer, remember the prayer, the Lord's Prayer is, hallowed be thy name, your will be done. Your kingdom come, your will be done. And that's what he prays, Father, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Now here, what does he model? He models love for your enemies. Here's the whole enemies coming to betray Jesus, take Jesus, and Jesus reaches out and uses this messianic miracle, and he compassionately heals Malchus's ear. He shows love for even his enemies. What a model for his disciples, what a model for us. And then lastly, when Jesus says to all of his betrayers there, including Judas, this is your hour. This is the power of darkness. This is the power of darkness. Satan is at work at this time, bringing the Messiah down. Let's read starting in verse 54. Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, this man also was with him. But he denied it, saying, woman, I do not know him. And a little later, someone else saw him and said, you also are one of them. But Peter said, man, I am not. And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean. Matthew tells us that it was his accent, his Galilean accent, that betrayed him. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you are talking about. Straight out lie and denial of Jesus. And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And listen to this. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. There's so much here, but just very briefly, we see Peter slowly moving away from Jesus. First, he follows Jesus at a distance, and then we see him grouping around not Jesus and the disciples, but the world, you could say, with culture. And then this leads him down a rabbit hole of denying Jesus left and right, finally to the point where he leaves altogether and weeps bitterly. Now, I want you to understand in this moment, Luke describes something profound. Right when Peter denies his rabbi, Jesus, the Lord looks at him, turns and looks at him. And when you think about that look that Jesus gave to Peter, I know it was a look of sadness. I mean, this was his friend. This is Jesus' friend. He loves him. He loves him. And he looks at him after Peter denies him for 3 times and looks at him, I'm sure with sadness, but I'm also sure that it was a look of compassion. Remember yesterday, Jesus said, I've prayed for you. And when you have turned again, when you've repented from this denial, strengthen your brothers. Jesus is looking at him to say, you have a second chance, Peter. You have a second chance. Now go and strengthen your brothers. Verse 63, now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. Verse 66, when day came, the assembly of the elders of this people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council, and they said, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. So they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, you say that I am. Then they said, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips. So here we have the beginning of Jesus' physical trial, his physical suffering. They're spitting on him, they're mocking him, they're making a fool of him. And sometimes when you read this, you might ask, well, you might think, Jesus, why didn't you just tell him that you were the Christ? Jesus here, when he says, if I tell you, you will not believe, that unbelief, this is the sign of the power of darkness. Jesus is making a very clear point. He's like, I'm not going to play your games. I'm not going to answer your questions, because even if I give you the right answer, which is yes, I am the Christ, I am the Son of God, you're not going to believe me. Because Judas, along with all of these chief priests and scribes, have followed the enemy in unbelief, and they are totally blinded from seeing the truth of who Jesus is. And yet, in and through the great power of darkness that seems to be making headway against the Messiah, and you can imagine Satan in the background saying, yes, this is so good. Through it all, Jesus says right there in verse 69, but from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. That is a clear description of his authority and of his fulfillment of the scriptures. Judas may betray the Son of Man with a kiss, but the Son of Man, no matter what happens to him, will sit at the right hand of the Father, executing his power and his judgment. So in and through it all, Jesus continues to follow the path to the cross. We'll see you tomorrow for our next passage.